Yeah. Okay, we are recording. Dan, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. Where are you? You at home?
I am. I'm in New Orleans and I'm about to move into a new place here. So I'm pretty excited yeah, I'm excited to move into a bigger place. I've been living in a very small cube for about 6 months. So I'm excited to leave the cube behind and
Fantastic.
move into a normal size place.
Yeah. That's not what you meant to do after lockdown, is move into a cube. That's
No, nobody wants to live in the cube. I mean, there's a Canadian film series called Cube that is a cautionary tale about, cube life and cube living in general. So, yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to be able to stretch out and actually have a place to record music and stuff. So,
wonderful. Wonderful. Dan, I kick off the podcast the same way for every episode, and I'm going to ask you for your first track. And with that, can you tell me, please, the song that you regard as having the greatest ever intro, please?
the greatest ever intro. For me, I think that is a track from the incredible Fall album, Perverted by Language, 1983, Smile.
Yeah, what a record.
I love the intro lyrically and musically. There's a really good version of them playing it live on the Tube, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah, watch
Uh
that.
it's a YouTube video and it's the classic double drummer lineup. So you get this intro that is just absolutely menacing, odd time signature, sort of riff folding in on itself, and this poisonous monologue by Marky Smith until the drums kick in, and I love it so much. It's
How did you how did you discover the Fall? Because they're very very British, and
yeah.
and lyrically it's as gritty and British as it gets. And I'm always interested when people overseas kind of sound check Marky Smith and the Fall.
Well, I got into them just through. So I grew up in a really small town, isolated, like working class town on Vancouver Island, and I had this book called the Trouser Press Guide to Alternative Music. And this book, it basically ran through like early 80s, late 70s through late 80s alternative music. And there's a section on the Fall where they review every single album up until I think right before the Matador record came out. And I couldn't get a hold of any of their music, right? Like it was sort of just nascent internet era. There's nowhere to buy records close to me. So I would just kind of imagine what they sounded like. And then eventually I found a cassette in Victoria, British Columbia. It was a compilation called Palace of Swords Reversed, which is a very weird, like mid sort of right before Perverted by Language, post Hex Induction Hour. There's very odd versions of the songs on there. There's some live stuff. And it immediately clicked with me. And I think the reason it clicked is really evident on Perverted by Language, which I would hear later, but it's his observation of the minutia of not small town life, but suburban life or ex-urban British life, and these characters that he sees all the time, and just infusing that with the weird, like the sort of almost HP. I know he references HP Lovecraft, but the sort of creeping weirdness of the everyday.
Yeah, yeah.
And I could really relate to that living in Couch and Lake, and just the kind of people that you'd meet.
Yeah.
Just
And the thing is as well, like I don't know, I don't think you get frontmen in bands like that anymore. Like he's so unique, and I'm sure at times was unbearable to be in a band with. And there's probably
mhm.
about 300 past members that will back that up. But I mean, what an unlikely a pop star. Like, they had such chart success over here as well. And like, what an
Yeah.
unlikely pop star, and so refreshing to see someone that just doesn't essentially give a fuck, like, and does not play by the rules. It was so exciting to see them. When you mentioned the Tube and that, seeing people like Marky Smith and that on there was so exciting.
I wonder, I mean, I've always wondered if that's site specific to the UK, to Britain itself, because I think their cover of Victoria um charted. Hey, maybe there's a ghost in my house
Yeah,
charted as well. And that's just, I mean, at least in Canada, I'm Canadian, that's unthinkable.
yeah.
We have kind of iconoclastic bands that have influenced people internationally, like Skinny Puppy, but there's
Mm.
no way Canadian television would ever touch them.
Yeah.
And maybe there's just something in the UK that allows weirdos to be able to get on the tube for like,
Yeah.
which is really cool. I
Yeah.
don't even think America has that, like.
Yeah, it was fantastic. I'm going to take you back for track two and ask you to tell me the first song that you remember hearing that had an emotional impact on you, please.
I think it would be the Cyndi Lauper song All Through the Night, which is off of her first album, I believe. But
Hmm.
I was riding, I have to spend a lot of time in the car with my dad, driving back and forth to the next town over from the small town I grew up in. And you know, our radio station is about five years behind the times, so uh it's just like full on 80s Coke ballads all
Yeah,
the time. And that was, I think that was the first song that really had an emotional impact on me. I mean, I knew it was sad, but I was a child, so I didn't know why it was sad. I was only reacting to the um musical setting of it and the emotion in her voice.
but that's
But
that's interesting, though, isn't it? That at a young age, it is that point where you suddenly hear something, and up until a certain point in your life, I think music's just sounds, isn't it? That you just sort of you move to or whatever, and
mhm.
then I think at some point, in your childhood, something resonates, whether it is a vocal, whether it is a lyric, whether it is a whatever it is within that record that just kind of hits you to the point where you think, right, there's levels. I can
Yeah.
be emotionally affected by this. I find that fascinating, and it can be the most surreal or the most obvious pop song, but something can just cut a little deeper. That first point, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just remembering too, there's an instrumental track that also emotionally affected me from the same era. My parents used to play the Genesis Invisible Touch record over and over again. And there's a track on there called The Brazilian that
Yeah,
is a pretty incredible instrumental piece. At the time when I was a kid, I was like, this is the most terrifying piece of music ever made. It's so
yeah.
scary. And then later I'm just like, oh, this is just Tony Banks being like, I need a track to wank off on,
That's
please. Like,
exactly what it was. It was a big Tony Wanks.
yeah,
It really was.
yeah.
But I guess at that point you probably not ever heard prog, and that
No,
was the sort of the sort of bravado of the 80s added prog to that as well, and that's when you get that kind of that track on Invisible Touch, which I've got to be honest, I quite like it as well.
I
It
love
is.
it. It's great. I mean, that's actually kind of an unexplored little node of music where these 70s prog bands who had kind of been regarded like you like to think that the punk movement and the post-punk movement and the new wave sort of cleared the road for pop music. But in reality, like a lot of those prog bands had their biggest hits in the 80s. Like
Yeah,
thinking about what is that huge Yes song from
Owner of a Lonely Heart.
Owner of a Lonely Heart, man. Trevor Horn production.
Yeah,
Incredible.
I mean, fucking hell, Sledgehammer.
Yeah,
Like,
okay, there you go. Yeah. Yeah,
uh,
any Phil Collins solo stuff too.
yeah,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
ridiculous. And I just remember being like when I was young and seeing bands like Peter Gabriel and seeing Genesis and Yes and Dire Straits and all of them kind of what were essentially the biggest bands on the planet at that time, and
Hmm.
just thinking they look like my dad's mates. They look like really old, and it's only when you sort of look back now you think. No, they were probably in their late 20s then, but they just
Yeah.
all looked really old. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it's because they've been. I mean, probably the last of the like '70s road warriors.
Yeah.
Hard living, and yeah. Neil. I mean, Neil Young looked really old when he was in his late 20s to me.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I bet Marquis Smith probably has looked the same for the last 50 years of his life. Like he just looked haggard from a very young age, and I think
Yeah.
he just wore it so well.
There was a real. I think once they put out Country on the Click, that was when I realized I was like, oh, Mark's looking a little melted. Like,
Yeah. He had a good time.
yeah,
um, well, look, you spoke about hearing music in your parents' car. Um,
yeah.
so tell us about growing up, and was home particularly musical, Dan?
Yeah, it was. My parents are both I guess you could call them hippies. My dad's kind of a proto hippie, sort of that like pinch on era of like the beatnik bleeding into hippie.
Yeah,
And my mom was definitely a hippie, full on hippie. And my dad was involved in the music scene in Vancouver to the extent that he couldn't really play anything or sing, but he did like to write lyrics. So he wrote lyrics for a psych rock band called Mayandol Ring, and I'm not sure if they used any of them, but he would move their organ around. He was like a roadie. And my mom, she lived in Quebec for a while in the early '70s, like when the FLQ crisis was going on, and Quebec culture was really vibrant. They love progressive rock there. So my mom kind of brought to the family a bunch of French prog rock albums. So growing up, it was a mix of French prog rock, disco records that my mom liked, and my dad's like psych rock stuff. So,
what about instruments? Was there instruments laying around?
well, neither of them could really play. So it was kind of on me to, I remember getting a Bon Tempi chord, like an air organ, kind of like one of those vacuum cleaner organs that you just
Yeah,
plug into the wall. And nylon string guitar and a
yeah,
cassette recorder, and that's what I started out with. Yeah,
wonderful.
yeah.
Tell me the song that reminds you of your time at school, please, Dan.
I gotta say, it's got I struggled over this one, but it's gotta be the Nirvana B-side to "Smells Like Teen Spirit." I bought the single for
Yeah,
"Smells Like Teen Spirit," and the B-side is "Even in His Youth." And I just thought it was, I mean, that was my first experience, I guess, like record collecting or being a record nerd. I just thought it was so cool that I had this thing that wasn't on the album, you
yeah.
know? Even though, we could say the single may be one of the most wasteful, musical products of all time. It's like,
You know what though? I think for that very reason that you like the B side of that because I grew up in the era where I would buy 7-inch singles
yeah,
and I wouldn't always flip it,
yeah,
and
yeah,
whereas
yeah,
when I bought a few cassette singles and put them in my Walkman, you listen to the second track because it just automatically came on, and I think
yeah, just auto
like
flip.
yeah, and I think that was a kind of a good thing. I think it's sort of you would you have heard that track if you had that on vinyl that Nirvana track? Maybe, maybe not. Like,
Yeah.
but on a cassette single, look at us bigging up the cassette single.
Yeah. I mean, I loved that song, and then I bought every cassette single by them I could find.
Yeah,
And at the same time, I also ended up once I started getting into dance music, I got like all the KLF stuff.
yeah.
There were all these like Canadian imprint KLF singles with like remixes. I think the KLF single was the first time I ever heard a remix. Like,
I
well, it
mean,
was it was cool. It was a good education.
absolutely. What a fantastic route into music, discovering the Fall, and then you got Jimmy Corty and Bill Drummond as well in your ear rolls because I mean
Yeah.
they're a crazy couple of fellas and what glorious racket they made as well.
Yeah, incredible. Like I I need to reread the manual. It's amazing. Just
Yeah,
situationist art and there what was it, the British Music Awards where they basically opened fire on the audience with blanks?
yeah. And then I
Yeah.
think afterwards I think they threw a dead sheep uh, into the doors of the after party, I believe. Uh, yeah, just fascinating. My best mate is he's a kind of one man comedy band that was originally called Cunt and the Gang. And he now has turned it into a band called the Cunts. And the last five Christmases, he's had a top five hit, like either calling Boris Johnson a fucking cunt, etc., etc., etc. Like whatever conservative politicians in it. But
Yeah.
he's done it all himself, and he's had like top five hits with it, which is bananas. But he reread the manual like ahead of this and said, "Look,
Yeah.
technology's changed, and like social media
Hmm.
is prevalent now, and whatnot. But the very essence of the manual still works. Like it
Yeah.
still holds up."
Yeah, it's like it's like reading Lenin. It's the immortal science of socialism continues on. You might not
Yeah,
be dealing with factories anymore, but yeah, there's something there in the manual.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, when you was at school, did you have any idea what you wanted to be?
Yeah, I mean, I really I mean, I always wanted to be a musician, but I really thought if I couldn't make that work, I would be a journalist. Which set me down a career of aborted academia. I attempted to put myself through university, working in kitchens. And eventually I was just like, well, I have to choose either between taking these history and poli sci classes and journalism classes, or I just keep working in the kitchen and focus on music, which
Yeah,
yeah, which I think and like eventually was the right decision because once I actually got to tour internationally and travel, which was mainly the reason I wanted to be a journalist, I was like, well, a lot of the fundamental things I thought I learned in these political science classes are inaccurate.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
once I started meeting people, and talking to them and getting to know them, especially touring Eastern Europe,
yeah,
uh, especially, yeah, just getting to know people, their experiences building DIY spaces or being in bands,
yeah,
it's a good education, better
yeah.
education than I could have got anywhere else, I think, for me personally.
Absolutely. I mean, just to before we move on to the next track, just to sort of talk a little about Nirvana.
Yeah,
Was that was that a big band for you as a young lad?
it was huge. Yeah. Yeah, I'd say the biggest. I mean, they were like a gateway drug. I think the two biggest bands in my youth were probably Nirvana and Metallica. Metallica pre-Black Album. I mean, the Black Album, I remember that was the first time I remember feeling disappointed or let down by a
Mm,
band ever. But Nirvana definitely like kind of kicked the door open for me. I think because they're from the Pacific Northwest as well, you know. They they grew up 2 hours away from where I grew up. So
yeah,
and I just felt like with them and then other bands I got into from that sort of Olympia punk scene, they really gave me the feeling like if they could do it, I could do it. I think a lot of people felt the same way. Like
yeah.
I think they were really inspiring for a lot of people.
And was that your first kind of introduction to Sub Pop?
Yeah. Yeah, it was. And then I bought everything I possibly could buy off that label.
Yeah,
Anything and everything, even the bad stuff, you
yeah.
know.
It's so crazy, isn't it? That like I think with a wave of sort of hysteria around Nirvana, like I probably never would have listened to Tad. I'd never have
Yeah.
probably have heard of Mudhoney, and it all come through Nirvana, and then all of a sudden, I wanted a Sub Pop T-shirt, and then it was like, right,
Hmm.
what else is on this album? And the same could be said for Creation Records, over here. Like as soon as Creation started happening, it was like anything on that label, I wanted it because
Yeah. Yeah.
99% of the time it was going to be decent.
Yeah. I think there's a British label called One Little Indian that
Yeah,
I bought almost everything I could find from
yeah,
as well once my taste started expanding.
yeah. Sugar
But
Cubes
yeah,
were on One Little Indian, weren't they?
yeah,
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah.
yeah,
That was big for me. But yeah, Nirvana kind of like opened the door too to like getting into British music. There was a Canadian television show called City Limits hosted by a British guy, and they would he would play whatever was happening in America, like the sort of grunge explosion, but then also play a lot of the shoegaze stuff that was happening in the UK.
yeah.
And I
And
just
Kurt,
tried to buy as much of it as possible.
yeah. I think Kurt really liked that as well, didn't he? Like, I think he was a big fan. I know he loved Teenage Fan Club and
Yeah.
uh, and yeah. Bizarrely, I actually recorded this podcast yesterday with Mark Gardner, a ride, and
Oh, no
so I
way.
I got to chat shoegaze yesterday, which was lovely.
Ah, it's amazing. That rocks. Yeah, that band too was huge for me. I remember mail ordering the Ride record. Like,
Really
yeah, I'd work, my crappy high school job and then save up money and mail order records and just wait for them to show up.
fantastic.
But yeah.
For the next track, I'm going to ask you while we're talking records, what was the first record you remember buying from a store?
First record was what do I have here? It was Metallica. Um, yeah, yeah, I bought Master of Puppets at the local video store. Um, they rented VCRs. You could rent, that's obviously a video store. You could rent tapes. But you could also buy cassettes. So I bought, yeah, Master of Puppets, and
Love it.
it was amazing. It was fantastic. So probably the best thrash album ever made, I think. And they never really topped that, I don't
Yeah,
think. Justice for All was, clearly like missing the influence of Cliff Burton. Everybody knows the mix on that record is fucking terrible. They mixed the new guy's bass out of existence. There's some great riffs on Justice, but it doesn't really hold a candle
yeah.
to it. I remember listening to that record constantly, and it being that was the first record where I was like, oh, here's a band singing about social issues.
Oh,
And in
really?
retro Yeah, and in retrospect, it's so goofy, it's so teenage, like
Yeah,
disposable heroes just singing about like World War One. Like, but that to me was more interesting than the metal bands who were singing about like
yeah.
Satan, you know? So
But however, sort of sixth form angst and whatever the kind of politics were, however lame they might have been, it again, like you said to Nirvana, it's a gateway, isn't it? And
yeah,
it can only get better and deeper from there, right?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, that led me to more interesting metal bands too. I got into Sepultura through them, and I did go through a period where I was like, not fast enough, not heavy enough. I think every teenage metalhead goes through a phase where they're like, I need to listen to the most extreme thing possible.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, how was it? Because I imagine Nevermind dropped round about the same time as the Black Album.
Yeah,
And like, was that the kind of moment where the kind of punk rock maybe kind of left metal behind?
kind of. Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, I guess you still had in the 90s, you still had bands like Helmet who were
Mm,
kind of towing the line between like less macho, like almost like art rock,
yeah,
meets metal. And I guess in Britain, there was like Justin Broderick and like Godflesh, like that stuff was really interesting to me.
Hmm.
But yeah, that was definitely a split, punk and metal kind of dividing.
And
The stuff the stuff that came after the Black Album, I was less interested in. I only
yeah,
tapped back into metal again in the early 2000s with
yeah,
stuff like Boris and
yeah.
Sun. Yeah.
Where did you sit around that time on bands like sort of Faith No More that had that kind of more sort of song based kind of pop sensibilities, but was really, really loud. Yet the vocals were really quite beautiful and soaring. Yet he could really growl as well. What was? I'm always interested when people like kind of punk rock and like their metal, because I think sort of Faith No More, like what you were saying about Helmet and that, they kind of sort of float in between. I would, like, as soon as you said
Yeah.
Helmet, I just thought of the Judgment Night soundtrack, and there was all of them kind of hybrid bands on there.
Yeah, that was, I mean, that was big for me too, Judgment Night soundtrack. But I think about this a lot in the late 80s, early 90s, even pre Nevermind, there was a moment where bands that would later be classified as alternative music were classified as kind of alternative metal because
Yeah,
the metal scene was so schizophrenic.
yeah,
Uh, it was like the end of the supremacy of glam metal. Like Motley Crue was putting out like fucking Dr. Feelgood, like uh, but then you also had Faith No More,
yeah.
and I mean even the Chili's I think got lumped into that.
Yeah, Chili's, Living Colour, Fishbone, they all got thrown in that kind of on the peripheries of that, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Which is a weird time, and I don't know. Thinking back on it, it was like maybe a little more open. It was less subdivided into genre.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Hmm.
Um. Okay. So, track 5, the song that
Yeah,
soundtracked your time going out clubbing.
song that soundtracked my time going out clubbing. I would have to say "Perfect Kiss" by New Order because I used to go to 80s night in Victoria a lot, and I'd always bug the DJs to put on "Perfect Kiss," like the extended mix with the
Yeah,
frogs.
yeah. What a record.
Lowlife was the first New Order I ever heard.
Right.
So it was, and I didn't realize that they were related to Joy Division at all.
Yeah,
Because so I'd heard like I think I'd heard Transmission, and then I bought Lowlife. I thought it was a completely different band,
yeah.
and I listened to Lowlife kind of as like a guilty pleasure. I hid it, from my other punk metalhead friends. The first song, Love Vigilantes, is like
Yeah,
I guess would have been a huge break in their own career stylistically because it's like the
yeah,
first thing that's got acoustic instruments on it. But I fucking loved that record.
yeah,
I wore that record out.
yeah.
And I
That's
and I
such a
loved
good
going
shout.
out dancing to that song.
Yeah. Did you stick with New Order?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I've been a fan pretty much since the first time I ever heard them, you
Yeah,
know. I
that's
don't I don't think there's another band that's been able to pull so much out of two chords.
yeah,
A lot of their songs are just two chords and
yeah,
and how much emotion they get out of those two chords is incredible.
yeah. Absolutely. And Bernard's voice on paper, he's not the greatest voice, but it just works perfectly.
Oh yeah, and you get to see it evolve over time
Yeah,
too, which is
yeah,
beautiful because you listen to their their version of Ceremony, he's still kind of singing like Ian,
yeah, yeah, definitely.
and then he completely grows out of it
Yeah,
around maybe around Power, Corruption, and Lies.
yeah. When you hear Bizarre Love Triangle and stuff like that, it's like he's found his voice then, hasn't he? And it's
Hmm.
completely him. Uh,
Yeah,
yeah, what a band.
seriously.
Uh, I'm gonna take you home for track 6, Dan, and tell me a favorite song from an artist from your home county, please.
Well, I gotta say, there's a song "Far Too Frail" by Skinny Puppy. I always have to talk about this band, but they came out of the ashes of a little heard new wave band from Vancouver called Images in Vogue, who had a keyboard player named Kevin Key, who would go on to form one of the first industrial bands. I mean, they were definitely aware of like Cabaret Voltaire, Throbbing Gristle, but they were one of the first bands to kind of weld that to like a more pop sensibility, which they would just deconstruct later on. Skinny Puppy never gets talked about in Canadian media, and I'm not sure why. They were like hugely influential on Nine Inch Nails, Ministry, but for whatever reason, Canada has kind of just like disowned them. But their first EP, I think it's 1984, is just so incredibly ahead of its time. And I still love putting it on. It's still got just like a very weird site specific thing happening. You can hear Vancouver, and you can also hear like the sort of milieu, like William Gibson was writing Neuromancer in Vancouver at the same time. It's kind of this birth of cyberpunk moment.
Yeah.
You can hear the late 80s, early 90s in this track from 1984. So yeah.
I mean, that statement in itself, crazy, isn't it? The fact that they were that ahead of their time. Because for me, in the UK, we was in the late 80s. I was getting into the kind of the industrial thing that was on coming through on mute records like Nitzer Ebb and Cam FDM and stuff like that, and hugely influenced by Skinny Puppy, as far as I'm concerned. Like you can
Yeah.
hear it like throughout, and you mentioned Godflesh earlier as well. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, there was that was an interesting time as kind of electronics and guitars kind of started to sort of come together aggressively in the sort of mid to late 80s. I thought it was a really fascinating time, and some of that industrial stuff hasn't held up so well, but the stuff that has still sounds so vital.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean that kind of mix of dance music culture to there's kind of a weird liberalizing freedom to a lot of it. Like a lot of the agitprop stuff too. I love like Laibach,
Yeah,
like some of Laibach's more conceptual performances and
yeah.
stuff.
I mean,
Yeah.
speaking of them, like that again, we mentioned Sub Pop and we mentioned Creation, but Mute Records as well. That was a
Oh
label
yeah.
that everything was going to be interesting at the very least. Like, yeah,
Yeah, absolutely.
uncomfortable at times, but always interesting.
Yeah, it's true. I'm
The-
not
the-
like I'm not throwing on Boyd Rice records anymore,
yeah,
any of that stuff. But like, I will say like Coil Current 93 as well.
mm,
That's something I came to like more recently in life. I'd say over the last 5 years,
mm,
I really dove into that more folk horror strain of industrial music.
yeah, yeah,
I think
absolutely.
it's something I just wasn't ready for when I was a kid because it
Yeah,
wasn't as immediately gratifying,
yeah, of course. Yeah, and it's your last track, and this is where you get to be a tastemaker. This is a song that you think many of the listeners of this podcast may not know that you would like them to hear.
Okay. I'm gonna have to say it's a recent band. They just put out a record. The band is called Liquid Mike, and the song is called K2. It's about smoking K2. Uh, This band has, I think, 4 or 5 records out. I don't think they're on a record label. They're from a small town in Michigan, and the singer is a postman. Um, and they sound like an incredible fusion of Cheap Trick, Guided by Voices, I think is a huge influence on them, but also Blue Album Weezer.
Nice.
Um, so it's this incredibly well crafted, but like very melancholy power pop that has a lot of like weight behind it. But it's really the lyrics that got me because the whole album, they have a song called Drug Dealer, which is teenage me relates to a lot. But But it's really about growing up in a small town that the economy, political economy, the material economy has completely left behind, and you're kind of living in the ruins of this small town. Um, and the lyrics and the way it's put together kind of struck me because I wrote some notes about this, but like in the West, like in North America at least, like the working class voice has kind of been swallowed up by this broader, dumber culture war where like working class music is now the provenance of country, which big pop country music in America and Canada is just basically you list products that are uh not woke, you know? You're
Yeah,
like, I love my big truck. I love this beer. You know, it's just utterly hollow, you know, and that's kind of a false working class voice. But there are a lot of people just like struggling through this new garbage economy, and this band is an incredible snapshot of that. And
yeah,
you know, just talking about like struggling, but not defeatist, like not pilled out. You know, they're making it work.
yeah,
And I think for me, this is like a nice snapshot of a summer in a town where nothing is happening anymore, you know?
yeah.
So K2 by Liquid Mike, you got to hear it.
Wonderful. Dan, we make it easy for people to go and listen to the songs that we've spoken about today because put together a little Spotify playlist to accompany the podcast so people can go and check out the tracks that we've spoken about. And obviously we'll be putting your music on there as well, which we should talk about. What's happening?
Well, I have a record coming out on March 15th. It's the first solo record under my own name I've ever done. I got to work with Randall Dunn, who produced most of the Sun O records. He's a psych metal producer. He did the last few Zola Jesus records. He and I have worked together on film soundtrack stuff before, but we really wanted to make like a kind of a psychedelic heavy pop record. And we recruited Matt Chamberlain to play drums. He's played with Bowie for a long time and Fiona Apple. He's been incredible to work with. And Brad Lehner from the American shoegaze band Medicine,
Oh, wow.
who's one of my favorite guitar players growing up. And we asked him to do one song. He nailed it. And then asked if he could play on the whole record. And that was that. We had a band. So
Love that.
Brad's going to be joining us on tour, even though he quit touring 10 years ago. So yeah. Yeah, so it's I don't know. I'm really proud of this record, if I can say that. I put a lot of records out under a lot of different banners, but you know, this one I do feel like this is kind of like the start of a new career for me. So I'm very
That's
happy.
exciting. That's so
Thanks.
exciting. If people want to keep up to speed with gigs and releases, where's the best place to keep up with you, Dan?
I am on social media. I'm on Twitter at let's see, D_Boeckner, and then I'm on Instagram at you just search my name on Instagram. I'm on there, Dan Boeckner.
We'll make it a lot easier for that for people to do that, Dan. We'll tag you in it when this episode drops. So if people aren't following you already, then they can do so.
All right, sounds great.
Dan, it's been an absolute joy talking great records with you today, mate. And
Yeah,
thank
man,
you
this has
so
been
much for your
fun.
time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. I hope people enjoy the playlist and can take a little musical journey.
And just lastly as well, you got a podcast, right?
Yeah, yeah. I have a podcast called The Fortune Kit. We cover music industry stuff, and we write probably the dumbest songs I've ever been involved with. So check it out. Yeah.
Wonderful. Dan, I'm going to press stop on here, but don't go anywhere.
Okay.